Good afternoon. We're coming to the end of our meeting, which has been very fruitful, very important for us, for the government. Organizing the MC11 was very important to give a signal to the world, having been questioned previously in terms of our trade policies. We felt that it was very important to be hosts, to open up our home to trade ministers from around the world and to show a different Argentina. The importance of organizing this negotiating forum consists of two or three aspects. On the one hand, to analyze the voice of the private sector and the discussion that the governments are having in the adjoining building in the Hilton. On the other hand, we wanted to leave a legacy for the WTO, for the MC, in terms of multilateral trade. And we wanted to leave a legacy of institutionalizing the voice of the private sector within the multilateral trading system. And we also felt it was very important to bring the WTO to the people, because it affects on a daily basis those who trade, those who export, those who import, those who produce. We also believe that the business forum is a way of expressing what's in the DNA of our government, our clear objective to integrate ourselves into the world, to use new technologies, and to do so in a gradual way, listening to those who are excluded and who are facing the biggest challenges. Therefore, when we decided to drive a number of agendas in the Ministerial Conference, we decided to emphasize agricultural issues, where Argentina has a lot of potential, but also we wanted to emphasize on the facilitation of SMEs and of e-commerce for the future of multilateral trade. I have some questions here for the distinguished panel members. And I would like to begin with Paulo. Paulo, I would like to ask you, what is your perspective on the challenges that you see for the coming years in terms of trade and investment?
I think at its time, clearly, a moment of transformation about the transformation of trade relationships. If we think of the post-war, of the international agreements that materialized in GATT, I mean, they put up with a whole expansion of economy. And when the WTO appeared and was incorporated, the fracture of the Soviet bloc was absorbed and also allowed to fit into the trade system. This was a new world, a reconfigured world. And in this period, the WTO has been a drive for expansion. After the second half of the 90s, from there on, China joining the system in the worldwide trade system, the speed with which China passed from 2% of trade to 40% of trade and closer to 18% of industrialized trade has exerted strong tension and pressure on the overall relationship system. And we've seen a technological transformation and an overall impact on network services. In that regard, that is. I believe the 2008 crisis shows the weaknesses of the rules system that has prevailed and was built as an aftermath of the Second World War that was extended and expanded from there on. I believe that from the viewpoint of companies, the economic dynamics, there is certain expectation about the reactions to adjust trade rules to a strong transformation such as this. So what is, in my opinion, what has caused and is causing this crisis perception as globalization advanced and advanced strongly. The inequality between countries and sectors in each country is clearly causing a strong reaction against globalization. From my point of view, what we're facing is the need for a sustainable globalization in time that allows legitimacy on the process. And what is key is the rules of the game. There are issues that have cropped up which are more than just the approach regarding tariffs and the request for support. In the WTO environment, they were contained, but today, such as the state-owned company presence, the state-owned enterprises have interfered, so to say, with the level playing fields. Very often, it actually has been altered by them. The fact that we now have obstacles to trade that nobody had thought of during this evolution, that's also quite an issue. Transparency rules are applied when there's transparency, visibility. This is also something that exerts pressure on the rules considering the future. So I think these are very important challenges for the worldwide community. How to approach this transformation, how to imagine globalization that needs to be rule-based. What we do implies a world of rules where transparency, reporting capability, clear roles, the role of the state-owned companies in economies, and investments in a level playing field. Side by side, hand by hand with commercial transformation. I am positive, I feel positively about the possibility of this still being an engine, a strong engine, but we need rules of the game, more comprehensive, differently, that will allow to stop a conflict between globalization and governance in some of the countries. Thank you. Precisely these challenges about the rules of worldwide trade, the ICC has developed and led the development of a series of recommendations, which we have recently filed with Roberto Acevedo and Susana Marcorra, Roberto Acevedo being the WTO director. So which would be your recommendation or the salient item in this paper produced all along the year?
As you have said just earlier this afternoon, I had the honor of presenting to the chair of the MC11, Susana Marcorra, the recommendations. They look like this, and in fact, you should be able to have a copy when you leave the room this afternoon. These recommendations represent the culmination of efforts that have been undertaken by the International Chamber of Commerce to put forward a set of recommendations which are, in a very broad way, in support of the World Trade Organization's overall agenda for a rules-based multilateral system based on free trade, free enterprise, free markets. We have sought to mobilize the international business community for not only the recommendations, but for this particular ministerial. And as you know, this is the first time that there has ever been a business forum that has been held actually alongside the ministerial. And Director General Roberto Azevedo is adamant that having established what he has called this historic occasion of having business included in the process, that this is something that would be repeated in all further ministerial conferences that, of course, as you know, are on a 2-year basis. We are strongly of the belief, and the recommendations support this, that trade openness underpinned by the multilateral trading system produces higher productivity, greater competition, lower prices, and improve living standards for all, and not to forget wider prices and lower, many wider choices and lower prices on consumer goods, as well as lifting hundreds of thousands out of poverty on a worldwide basis. So that is the crux of the recommendations that have been presented today.
Thank you, John. Rick, earlier today, no, yesterday, we have the launch of an electronic platform enabling e-commerce around the world. I think it's a great example of the positive outcomes that you can reach out of a good public-private collaboration and dialogue. What do you think is the role of that kind of dialogue in the face of all these challenges that we are facing today?
Well, it's clear that many of the challenges that have just been articulated of needing a more inclusive approach to trade and to economic growth more generally can only be tackled by a combination of better policy on the one hand and wider engagement of actors and an improvement of the enabling environment in many domains that go way beyond what a national government can do, or let alone what a multilateral treaty could address. And no field, I think, is more emblematic of that than in e-commerce. Yes, it is useful to have international discussions about e-commerce. But first and foremost, there are a range of market infrastructure issues that are very important for countries to get right, or at least to progress, if they want to expand the promise of e-commerce in their economies, and thereby engage more small and medium-sized enterprises through that medium. Things like the way electronic payments are processed. That's not solely a function of international treaties or negotiations. That has to do with basically a combination of industry standards and practices and enabling conditions that the corresponding regulatory agency, whether on the financial side or the consumer side, or indeed in your ministry on the commerce side, do to try to optimize the enabling environment for innovation to occur in that space, and then for some degree of interoperability and scaling to take place. The consumer protection, e-signatures, and electronic transactions, the way the customs system operates, having a streamlined single window, an API that enables much more efficiently and digitally, with a lower opportunity for corruption in the system, individual actors in the trading system to access that information and conduct transactions. Again, this is market infrastructure by and large, and that typically it develops through a combination of innovation, private practice, industry standards sometimes, and yes, conducive enabling environment regulation by governments. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that there's no perfect solution to yet. This is still a relatively new area, and there's a lot that countries can learn by taking a look at what is working in other countries and in other industry groupings, and that's what this Enabling E-commerce initiative is intended to do. It builds on some of the business dialogue and B20 discussions that have been held previously, identifying e-commerce as a big opportunity for the trading system. But it takes the view that we need a wider international public-private dialogue process to identify good policy models, to identify industry practices that are working well, identify gaps in different countries, and thereby provide an opportunity for, on a voluntary basis, for those countries that want to upgrade their enabling environment for e-commerce to do so through a peer and public-private dynamic along those lines. Now, we happen to think that if we do this well, building on B20 recommendations, the trade dialogues discussion, some of the work that we've been doing in our trade initiative over the years, that if we do this kind of a rolling public-private laboratory or dialogue along the lines I've described, then it will become clearer what the room is for multilateral discussion and maybe even norm setting in this process. And I think that's partly why the WTO is involved, is it sees that it's complementary to have an informal process of this, looking at these kind of practical issues, go on, even while within the multilateral intergovernmental domain, there's some discussions about what could be a specific work program. So these two elements are symbiotic, and they're a new way, a new geometry of how we ought to think about improving the trading system.
Thank you, Rick. Daniel, creo que Rick dio una.
I think that Rick gave a very clear idea about the importance of public-private partnerships. I think there were many conclusions that could be drawn in terms of trade and investment in 2017. What do you think these reflections are, and how do they shape the B20 agenda for next year? Well, first of all, I would like to highlight, as the chair of B20, I'd like to thank not only for the fact that we've been given this responsibility, but also thank my co-chairs and the fantastic team of leaders. And firstly, we believe in public-private dialogue and the need for it. Secondly, we believe in multilateralism. We are convinced that that is the space where it should be developed. And then we believe that the largest commitment that Argentina has taken is that we want to integrate into the world in an active and responsible fashion through this dialogue. So I believe that in this growing process, the B20 has been occupying space in this G20 dialogue, and there's important elements that have appeared. Firstly, this dialogue could be concluded in recommendations, suggestions to governments for their final declaration. Secondly, that even the most complex issues and diverse situations deserve this effort on behalf of the business sector. Thirdly, it is not only about generating recommendations that will be assumed in the final delegation, but that have the possibility of being implemented and followed up on. This is our national and regional point of view. We believe this to be very important. And finally, I would say that over this last year, where we've seen this transition process between the summit in Berlin from April to date, with our German colleagues, we've carried out a coordinated, harmonized transition, and we have clearly set out some objectives. It has to be inclusive trade with clear rules of the game. It's twofold, and this is also applicable for countries that have had an attitude of wanting to isolate themselves. Secondly, the digital economy in all its different versions, and here I particularly recall the meeting that we held with Foreign Minister Angela Merkel, the Chancellor Angela Merkel, where she insisted on the transforming effect that digital transformation has. And thirdly, trade facilitation. These are very important aspects. And why have we come to the WTO, and why has B20 co-participated and shared this meeting that they have invited us to? First of all, because we believe that the private presence in the framework of the WTO is very important. Secondly, because we believe that this is the place where disputes should be settled, the natural disputes that arise from trade. Thirdly, because there are positive data about how the 2008 crisis has evolved, but they are also complex. The issue of jobs, there's 200 million, for example, jobs. We can see that there's been certain growth, 3,000, 2,000 per year, but these figures show a trend that is difficult to recover from, but we have to make an effort. And all of this has to do with certain goals. Goals which, in the case of our country, have been set to do with education, infrastructure, and thirdly, the issue of the future of food sustainability, which is a new issue on the agenda, on our agenda, and we have dealt with it sporadically. But all of these issues lead us, and with this I will conclude, to first, we are concluded that the private sector, not only in Argentina but at an international level, has a role to play. In our case, we have a deficit, a very large deficit in terms of participation. And then this situation is complex, especially for countries like ours that have come out of populism, and we're breaking canons. We have to make changes and transformations. And thirdly, experience shows us in G20, at least on certain types of problems, that there's a group of countries that have guidelines that more or less follow ordered criteria, while we have our own national or regional rules. So we have to deal with these in order to make sure that they're all homogeneous. So we believe in this dialogue, we believe in these opportunities, and we also believe that the WTO will become a key cornerstone within the strategy of the G20, the B20, in the framework of the G20.
I would like to ask a question to all of you, and I would like you to reflect on this. We are living through technological changes. We see them every day, the future of production, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, all sorts of changes, technological revolutions that have an impact on us day by day. We're seeing political changes worldwide, in Latin America, in Europe, in North America, in Asia, tremendous political changes, economic changes, institutional changes, big changes that show that this is a different age. I'm under the impression that people take some time to adapt to those changes. So what do you think? If you had to identify which would be the most important, the most significant change we ought to do, people, us as individuals, whether in office or in the private sector or part of the civil society, what do we need to adjust, to change in our day-to-day practices, in the way to work, to communicate, to establish interrelationships? What should we change to adapt, to change, to adjust to this change of ages that is affecting people, governments, companies? And this is a question I'd like you all to answer. What should we work at? What should we reflect on? What should we change? Daniel?
I think that the first question that we need to understand is that we live in a global world. Globalization is a reality. We couldn't change that. What we need to do is to understand the process and to enter into the process logically, reasonably, and taking into account our own realities, because there is no one answer to all the possibilities could be resumed in one answer. The second one is adaptation, flexibility. For us, as business community, it's easy to adapt. But there are other sectors of the society, the workers, that are reluctant to this adaptation. And then the third pillar, that is education. I think that we need a real, in our case, clearly, a real revolution. If we do not have an educational system that could respond to these new technological realities, then we will face a big problem. Not only because at the labor market, with people excluded, or plants that are not coming because the question of technology couldn't be resolved in the country. Then there are migrations in order to try to find that jobs that are qualified jobs for the people. Then in order to harmonize that, we need clearly to make a substantive proposal to the society to change the patterns and to adapt the educational system to these new realities.
Education.
You know, if I may say something, Daniel, on your behalf, I know that Daniel is embarking upon, let's call it a regional educational program with regards to the Business 20 throughout Argentina. This is so crucial to get the buy-in from civil society, from local populations, some of whom are disenfranchised, some who feel they have not benefited from globalization, who don't understand what the subject is. To educate the population with regards to the benefits, the potential benefits of our MC11 recommendations, all of this is essential to the process. And if I may say, I'd like to commend you for embarking upon that program. It's very important for Argentina to have that awareness, to have that knowledge amongst the population, not just the business community. We know what trade is all about. We know what growth is all about. We know what we're trying to do in our businesses. But the general population needs to also understand the benefits.
Rick?
Yeah, I think you're very right to identify that this has been a period of tremendous change and churn and ferment in society. If you think about it, technological change, global integration of goods, services, finance, migration in many countries has also introduced a big element of change in society. And then deregulation or privatization. Many countries have embarked upon, over the last couple of decades, significant change in that regard as well. I like to think of that as what I call a quadruple cocktail of change, of social ferment. And I think that what's very important going forward is to recognize that we need to speak and also think in a different way about economic performance. And by that I mean that we need to recognize that growth and trade is a very important contributor to growth, because both of these are about improving the efficiency of the allocation of resources in an economy. These are really important because you can't expand the pie unless you've got growth. However, it's necessary but not sufficient, and both in an economic sense and a political sense. Economic in the sense that the GDP number is really not the bottom line of economic performance from any reasonable social definition. The bottom line is living standards improvement, and whether those progress in living standards have been broad and strong. Growth is a contributor. It's a sine qua non of it, but it's not all of it. There are other policy instruments that matter, have a big bearing on how well growth diffuses, both in terms of employment opportunity on the one hand, income, quality of life, and economic security throughout the population. So I think what's important for the business community and for the governmental community is to begin to change their language about talking about economics and economic policy, and acknowledge to the population that we're not doing technology disruption for the sake of technology disruption. We understand that that plays one role in driving growth, but that there is an equal degree of responsibility and weight that needs to be placed on a range of institutional and structural features of the economy, ranging from how well your education system performs to how well the labor market policies are operating to help ensure that productivity and wages rise in tandem, to rents, how well rents are recycled, and policy is very important for that, how well the financial system mobilizes private finance for real economy investment as opposed to just exchanges of assets, to social protection, to basic services, infrastructure for connectivity. Each of these areas we've identified in something we issued earlier this year called the Inclusive Growth and Development Framework and Report, and 15 different areas where stronger institutions can have a win-win for growth and social inclusion on the other. That part of the agenda doesn't get talked that much about by finance ministers or trade ministers, but they need help from the rest of government in a range of these areas. The country needs to have a holistic strategy across these things, in addition to pursuing openness and financial stability and macroeconomic prudence. And I think the way to begin to get credibility with our society is to begin to recognize that explicitly and talk about transition, change, and other types of measures that can be taken that can help ensure that the benefits are diffused broadly.
Thanks, Rick. Paolo.
Well, I think your question is how this impact on let's say, the position of everybody, the personal position in looking at this. From my point of view, when you are facing such a deep transformation and fast transformation, you need to be able to break paradigm. Because in the end, the reality is breaking paradigm, and we need to be prepared to accept this. Otherwise, institutions that are overwhelmed by the changes will just dismember. We see the United Nations in some of the agencies of the United Nations in which they just don't respond to the changes in reality, and they lose consensus, and they lose support, they lose effectivity. So personally, I think everybody should be prepared to breaking some of the paradigms and see how this could be changed. In the case of trade, investment is, for instance, one of the issues that we are that is part of the B20. I think the business community may be able to identify these changes and send a message that is, in some case, disruption. Business does disruption in everyday life, and we have seen a lot of disruption in the recent times because of the entrance of different way of communicating, different way of managing internet-based business, for sure. But we need to see if we can, in the B20, from my point of view on trade and investment, be able to receive indication of a change of paradigm that could be then reflected in the way we approach trade, investment, and the rules. It's clear, we all would like to live in a world in which rules are prevailing and are enforced, but at the same time, we are also aware that this set of rules need transformation, need changes, because of the changes that happens in the reality. Our challenge today, I don't think, is to explain that globalization is good. Our challenge is to adjust the tools and the way globalization acts in a way that make it in the interest of people. You can talk to people and explain to them that losing a job is a good thing for them. It's pretty difficult. I would prefer to explain to people the concrete action that we are taking to train, re-prepare, support, and the action that are taken to make this process acceptable for one generation, not for the third generation down the line. This implies a personal willingness to change paradigm, and in some cases, concerning international institutions, may have a disruptive impact. The world is changing. We need to be prepared to this, from my point of view.
Muchas gracias. Ha sido un placer.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to have you with us. I would like to thank very particular B20, the World Economic Forum, and the International Chamber of Commerce for the support to host this business forum, and we're sure we will see you shortly. Thank you very much.
No, entra después. Entro yo.